Good evening. How's everybody this evening? I'm Rob Hillis, Vice Chair of the Friends of the Institute, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you and introduce our speaker, George Steinmetz, 2017-18 Visiting Professor in the School of Social Science. Dr. Steinmetz's home institution is the University of Michigan. He's probably been watching basketball, where he is the Charles Tilly Collegiate Professor of Sociology. After doing undergraduate work at Reed College and the University of Paris 6, he went on to the University of Wisconsin-Madison to earn a BA in German Literature and Languages and Psychology, a master's in Sociology, and a PhD in Sociology in 1987. Before his appointment as Charles Tilly Professor at Michigan in 2009, Dr. Steinmetz held positions at the University of Chicago, École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, and the New School for Social Research. His research interests include empires, states, and cities, social theory, and the history and philosophy of the social sciences. Dr. Steinmetz is widely published, including numerous articles, book chapters, essays, scholarly journals, and reviews. His most recent book is The Devil's Handwriting, Pre-Coloniality and the German Colonial State in Qingdao, Samoa, and Southwest Africa, in which he discusses Germany's overseas colonial empire and the question of why Germany treated these colonies in such different ways. At the Institute, he is co-leading with Didier Fassin the School of Social Sciences 2017-18 theme year on the social sciences in a changing world. Dr. Steinmetz is also working on a new book entitled Colonial Sociology, The Origins of a Scientific Discipline in the French and British Overseas Empires, 1930s to 1960s. Tonight, we are delighted that Dr. Steinmetz will educate us on the how and why we write the history of the social sciences. Following the talk, Dr. Steinmetz will take questions. Please join me in thanking Dr. Steinmetz for giving us a nice evening.
Thank you. And Pamela Hughes suggested that I might talk about this theme that we're pursuing this year at the School of the Social Science, which is the sociology and the history of the social sciences. So I'll incorporate in my comments a number of examples, both from my own research and from the work of the other participants in this year's seminar. But in order not to do violence to their work, I'll talk a little bit more about my own. In order to structure the presentation, however, I want to start with a question that may be already formulating itself in your minds, namely, why on earth would anyone want to write the history of something like sociology or anthropology? What do we gain from analyzing social scientists like many of those of us in this room while we're at work? Some colleagues of mine once wrote a paper called What Do Historical Sociologists Do All Day? And I told them what I do all day is sit at my desk. So that was an exciting paper to read, I'll tell you. Many writers have suggested, however, that putting science under the historical or sociological microscope is a useless distraction at best and self-indulgent at worst. One Nazi sociologist called E.W. Eschmann, who I'm not showing you a photo of, but I'm showing you his article here, suggested in this article in 1934 that, and I'll translate, a science that turns itself into its own analytic object represents a, quote, symptom of the profound sickness of an entire culture and a pathology of scientificity, end quote. So that's the worst possible critique we could get. Of course, by starting with such an odious critic, I may seem to be stacking the deck in favor of our project. Who could agree, after all, with a Nazi? But Eschmann's comment does raise an important point, which is that the study of science and knowledge did indeed begin during a very crisis-ridden period and primarily began in Central Europe between 1900 and 1933. More precisely, it began in Budapest, and I've got some photographs of that moment here, in the years leading up to the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in World War I. I'm referring to the so-called Sunday Circle meetings held in Budapest during World War I, which included such famous philosophers as Georg Lukács, shown in the bottom left, and not to be confused with George Lucas, the filmmaker. Sometimes people do that, but it's a different spelling slightly. And then the future sociologist Karl Mannheim, shown on the right. Lukács is an interesting starting point for the discussion of the history of science. Lukács built upon Marx's earlier arguments that linked economic theories of Marx's own era, the economists who were active right up until Marx's life, to what Marx called the class interests of the bourgeoisie. He also looked at, he had a theory that religious belief was derived from social structures, and a theory that explained mystification about the actual logics of capitalism in terms of something he called the fetishism of commodities. Building on these ideas, Lukács argued that capitalism leads people to regard social processes as being like things, as having inexorable, impenetrable, law-like laws of motion, like natural laws. This leads to the permeation of our culture and our economic theories by models of economic rational calculation, and to forms of social science that imagine society as a kind of a machine, or as a kind of a biological organism, or as a kind of a natural phenomenon. Lukács then introduced a really important proviso to this image, however, of the all-pervasive mystification that we suffer under, which is that the working class, as the people who are directly on the front line producing the commodities that are sold on the market, may themselves be able to pierce through this veil of illusion for reasons that I won't go into. But this is an interesting starting point for our story, because this is the beginning of the so-called standpoint theories of knowledge, which link specific locations in social structure and the structures of power and domination, such as after Lukács, the positions of being a dominated gender, women, being a dominated racial group, to privileged forms of insight into the structures of social power. Even if one doesn't accept these ideas about ideological mystification and situationally determined insight, what was crucial about these early theories is that they suggested the following. Forms of knowledge are socially determined, and that different groups have different social epistemologies, and by that I mean different ways of seeing the world, understanding the world, making sense of the world, by virtue of their social locations. This set the stage for the sociology of knowledge, which was invented really in Weimar, Germany between 1918 and 1933 by the circle around Karl Mannheim. Mannheim is the man in the middle, sitting at a table with his students at a cafe that still exists in Frankfurt called Café Laumer. And one of his most famous students is the man on the bottom left, who's Norbert Elias, who with Mannheim was driven into exile when Hitler came to power in London. And the photo was taken by a famous student of Mannheim's called Giselle Freund, whose photographs are extremely famous from this period. Mannheim's lasting contribution is his argument that the intellectual field is divided into a series of distinct ideological styles of thinking. And these styles of thinking express, he argued, the social situation of a particular social class or a social stratum. He calls these social carriers of ideological styles. Social knowledge, he argues, is socially rooted knowledge. The next step in the evolution of the sociology of knowledge and the sociology of science, the bridge between the sociology of knowledge and making sense of science in terms of social theory, is connected to the Austrian philosopher Edgar Zilsel, who emigrated to the United States in 1939. Zilsel also looked for the sources of knowledge in society, like Mannheim and Lukács, but he also focused explicitly on the natural sciences, and this was the breakthrough in his work. He paid more attention also not just to social class, but to the effects of religion, law, and so on the politics of knowledge. And in a really excellent paper, I've given you the first page here, if you can read it, from the American Sociological Journal of Sociology in 1942, called The Sociological Roots of Science, Zilsel argued that the rise of the scientific spirit itself, the very ability to do science, was not due to capitalism per se, but to the interaction between three very different social groups in Europe between 1300 and 1600. The first two groups were university scholars, and the second was humanists at the university. And these groups, he argued, were trained to think rationally and to think rationally about everything, but they despised manual labor because of their class position. And they also shied away from experimentation and dissection and things like that, which were considered to be kind of manual labor-like things to do. The third group, however, were the skilled craftsmen, and the skilled craftsmen, unlike the other two groups, lacked methodical intellectual training, but they specialized in causal thinking, he argued. And it was when the elite groups finally overcame their social prejudices against the social craftsmen that the spirit of science was born, he argued. The experimental method could now be adopted by the people trained in rational thinking. Again, I find some of the historical details of Zilzel's thesis less interesting here than the fact that he pointed to a more multifaceted and multi-causal approach to explaining science. Now, the origin of the sociology of science and knowledge in crisis-ridden Central Europe in this period doesn't mean that this way of thinking only flourishes in crisis. Indeed, there's been a steady outpouring of the history of science throughout the last couple of centuries, which portrays the history of science as a heroic story of inexorable progress. Historians Ted Porter and Dorothy Ross write that this approach, quote, regards discoveries that comport with our current knowledge as natural and laudable, while condemning the prejudices and misconceptions that could have led scientists ever to believe what we now take to be false, end quote. Paradoxically, this kind of history, which is the main kind of history of science, was uninteresting for obvious reasons to practicing scientists, because who on earth would be interested in revisiting theories that have been rejected? And the same should hold ipso facto for us social scientists, one would think. This is the so-called Whiggish approach, or Whig history. This started to be undermined of science, and this started to be undermined in the 1960s, particularly by historian Thomas Kuhn, shown here, who spent some time, I guess, at the Institute for Advanced Study, too. His well-known book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, was published in 1962, and as the cultural revolutions of the 60s burgeoned, so did the history and sociology of science. Rather than continuing, however, to explore the sociological and historical approaches that came out of Kuhn's work, I want to instead use these approaches to inform the rest of my comments. And these comments will address the question in my title: why and how should we write the history of the social sciences? So the rest of my comments will be divided into three parts. In the first part, I want to always start negatively, so I'll talk about how not to write the history of the social sciences. Then I'll move to a more positive train of thought and ask why we should be interested in these historical sociological studies of the social sciences. And in the last section of my comments, I'll ask how do we go about studying the social sciences? With what theories, questions, methods, and models should we do this? And then I'll summarize some of the work that we're doing in the theme seminar this year, which is focused on this topic at the School of Social Science. So part one, how not to write the history of the social science. Just as these Whig approaches of science to science as inexorable progress have not disappeared, by the same token, there are very problematic reasons being bandied about for writing the history of social science. One such bad reason that we read frequently is that writing the history of social science is useful for legitimating a discipline. It's interesting in this regard that the first generation of American sociologists who created sociology in US universities tried to do this precisely by writing the prehistory of their discipline, going back and finding putative founders. This was a way of demonstrating the supposedly deep intellectual roots of this parvenu science. Most recently, some have argued that writing the history of a social science can be useful for building solidarity among all of us in a fragmented period, or for building consensus within our disciplines, or for demonstrating, quote, the extent to which there's been progress in the field and help defend it from attack. Now, you can see why social science administrators might want to do this, but this is a bad way, I think, to start the history of the social sciences. These are all not very productive. I agree with it. Instead, the French sociologist Christian Topolov, who writes that, quote, every discipline secretes its own official history, end quote. A serious history, then, should not understand itself as contributing to this ongoing process of secretion, but instead may be interested in analyzing critically for the reasons for this very process of putting forward traditions and legitimations and so on that don't appear to be backed by evidence. Before answering the questions about how to do this and why to do this, I want to mention one other problematic justification. Just as the history of social science shouldn't be imagined as a history of heroic figures, it should not be imagined as a direct converse of that, I think. The recovery posthumously of neglected figures. Of course, we should and can write histories and biographies and autobiographies sociologically and historically, and indeed two of the most interesting recent examples of this are Pierre Bourdieu, the French sociologist shown on the left, who showed in his self-analysis how he could apply his theories to his own life, and then the the French philosopher and public intellectual Didier Eribon, who showed in his really brilliant autobiography, Returning to Reims, how he could use the theories of Pierre Bourdieu to shed light on his own life. I will return to this question of linking biography to social structure in the last part of my talk. So part two, why should we write the history of the social science? I want to first discuss the contributions of this work to the social sciences themselves. That's probably something of more interest to the social scientists in the room. And I want to argue that the historical sociology of social science is indispensable to all aspects of social science. I'll then discuss the ways that research in this field can shed light on events and processes that may be interesting to other people. For example, understanding revolutions, financial collapses, gigantic social and political events of that sort. The first argument focuses on understanding the social and historical determination of our own starting positions as social scientists and the hidden subtexts of our own categories and concepts. The second reason that I'm going to give emphasizes the recovery of forgotten ideas that are worth recovering. The third contribution is to understanding the conditions for scientific flourishing and its opposite, decay. And the fourth is to examine the ways that social science affects the extra-scientific world. The first argument focuses on understanding the social determinants of our own starting positions that we begin social research with. And this shouldn't be imagined as a kind of a confessional. We often read nowadays in social sciences the equivalent of a television confessional. I am this kind of a person. That's not what we're talking about here, I think. What we're talking about is something that Pierre Bourdieu, to go back to him, calls self-objectification, objectifying one's own social structuring of one's own assumptions and methods and the ways that these shape our research. A specifically historical analysis can contribute to this by illuminating the ways in which our current conceptual categories, our current languages, the words we use to discuss social processes and practices contain traces of earlier scientific theories and earlier scientific battles that were won and whose outcome we're no longer aware of. A historical excavation of meaning can reveal these buried significations and connotations. One interesting example of this concerns the very word that's at the heart of the section of the IAS that we're associated with, social science. This word social science is far from innocent. A historical reconstruction of the labels that have been used to identify the genus to which this disciplinary species like sociology belong reveals a whole array of terms, ranging from the French term science, sciences humaines, or human sciences, to the German Geisteswissenschaften, or sciences of the spirit or mind, to the American term behavioral science that was used in Cold War America, and to which we devoted one of the sessions of our theme seminar this year. Each of these terms was preferred by different actors in different contexts. US actors pressed for the use of the phrase social science in the context of struggles with French social scientists in UNESCO during the late 1940s and 1950s. UNESCO was located in Paris, but the lion's share of the funding came from the US. The US won the first battle. The French eventually succeeded in getting rid of the term social sciences and inserting the word sciences humaines in the 60s. It's worth noting that sociology in France at this time was still located in the letters or humanities departments of the French university. In the United States, however, the phrase behavioral sciences was deliberately chosen in 1949 by the Ford Foundation when they began a program to fund what had previously been known as the social sciences. This was intended to avoid any confusion of social science with socialism. That was the main concern, but also to emphasize a more mathematical, individual-based approach to the study of social life. The German situation represented yet another extreme, and I won't go into detail about that case, but suffice it to say that the debate was largely decided by the Nazi regime, and then the icing on the cake was when the American occupiers came in after World War II and threw their weight behind that same solution. The point is that no matter which label one uses for the social sciences, it bears traces of these earlier disputes, and historical reconstruction can sometimes reveal those and call into question our current language. This can then become part of our own self-objectification, to use the term from Pierre Bourdieu that I used before. The second point about why I think we need to study the past is this. good social scientific theories and concepts that have been collectively forgotten can often be recovered and reintroduced by historians of social science. Here we have to insist that social science is not an entirely cumulative endeavor. Thomas Kuhn already made this point with respect to the natural sciences. That was one of his key arguments. Kuhn argues the development of science is not, in fact, a smooth, uniform, upward trajectory, but goes in fits and starts, alternating phases that he called normal and revolutionary. Periods of normal science are distinguished, Kuhn argued, by the commitment of all scientists to a common matrix of beliefs. It's actually a fairly conservative, stable period, he argued, in normal science. And it distinguishes it from the revolutionary periods, which are sparked when scientists come to see that there's an accumulation of anomalies that they can't make sense of in terms of their older theories, and that remain unaccounted for. The important point for me in Kuhn's account is that revolutionary science, in his terms, is not entirely cumulative either. It doesn't bring the entire body of knowledge from the normal period with it, but in fact necessarily loses some of the accomplishments and achievements of the preceding period. This is in the technical literature known as Kuhn loss. You lose something in every period. Scientific progress entails loss. In the social sciences, some of the best theories that are in circulation today had to first be recovered by historians of social science. Examples include the three thinkers that are most widely taught in sociology classrooms to students today, namely Karl Marx, Max Weber, and Emil Durkheim. Karl Marx, serious research on him or his theories was largely excluded from professional social science, both in Germany and the US, up until the 60s, the late 60s, 1960s. Durkheim and Weber were both widely dismissed as outmoded after World War II, even in France. And preferred, or at least by some figures, they preferred American-style sociology at that time. And it was only in the mid-60s that a serious reappropriation of Max Weber on the one hand, and Germany, reappropriation of Durkheim countries. There's additional reasons for revisiting social theories that were generated in the early phases of modern history. And this is a kind of a separate reason. The point I'm trying to make here, and this is a point that's made by the German sociologist Lothar Pater, who's not a very well-known name, but I want to attribute it to him because he made this argument, is that as modern social phenomena like capitalist industrialization, secularization, individualization become more and more ubiquitous, they also become more invisible and more taken for granted. They become the water in which we swim as the fish of this society. Earlier observers who had a foot in two different worlds, for example, a pre-capitalist world and a capitalist world, a religious world and a secular world, may have been able, in many cases, to better perceive these new processes than we are today. So it's worth going back to them for that reason. I'll give you an example of that in a moment. A really interesting example of this is a German geographer called Friedrich Ratzel, whose 1876 travel narrative in North America called Sketches of Urban and Cultural Life in North America actually concludes with a chapter called Ruins. And this is a chapter about the ruins that he sees growing up in America. He writes, according to Ratzel, America is, quote, aging fast. There are cultural ruins everywhere. This is in the 1870s. Well, our own European castle and monastery ruins are the funerary monuments of an era that has completely vanished. The ruins of America are witnesses of a swift life that don't comfort us, end quote. So 100 years before the decline of the great cities such as Detroit began, he already foresaw this. A third industrial scientific benefit of the history of social science is to better understand the conditions in which social science can flourish and, on the contrary, the conditions in which it deteriorates. I tried to investigate this with a case study of cross-disciplinary interactions between historians and sociologists in France and Germany during the 20th century. And what I found here was that there were two cases, both of them in France, in which interdisciplinary knowledge along this axis of sociology and history produced very valuable new forms of knowledge and insights. The first case involved interactions between historians associated with the new interwar history journal called Annales that was created by Marc Bloch, shown on the left here, together with Lucien Febvre, and with some of the sociologists who were the sort of second generation of students of Emil Durkheim, who died in World War I. And the leading figure there was Maurice Halbwachs, shown on the right. And what was really interesting for me was to look at the ways in which there was a kind of a dialectical or a dialogue between these two in which their categories began to change, even though they were located in two different disciplines at the time. And this was particularly around the topic of collective memory, which is the one that Halbwachs is associated with, but that Bloch also uses pretty extensively in his work, and it's a result of that. The second case actually involves the fourth generation of historians from the same journal and sociologists around that sociologist Pierre Bourdieu that I showed a moment ago. And I find that that's produced some very interesting mixes of history and sociology and new forms of knowledge. It's enriched both fields in many ways. These insights flowed from cross-disciplinary encounters where three principal factors, I argue, were simultaneously present. First, it was important that the two disciplines were relatively equal in status. If one was higher or the other lower, or if one was on a downward trajectory, the other on an upward trajectory, these were negatively impacting interdisciplinarity. Secondly, the form of interactions had to be sustained, dialogic, the way I described, involving iterated or recursive exchanges rather than a rigid disciplinary division of labor in which the sociologists did surveys and the historians went to the archives or something like that. And third, it was absolutely crucial that both disciplines benefited from a great deal of scientific autonomy. This was the key distinction that differentiated the French cases from the German case, at least during the Nazi period. But during the period before the war and after the war, the same was true for different reasons. And I'll just summarize that briefly. Before the war, sociology in Germany was much weaker than history in the interdisciplinary division of labor. Historians disdained sociology, and they were primarily politically conservative, while sociologists were primarily liberal or left. And the result was a form of historical sociology within sociology without any real interaction with historians or input from historians. In West Germany, that's the second case that's non-dictatorial case. In the 60s and 70s, the historians were again more powerful than the sociologists, but at this time the historians developed a kind of a sociological history without any input from sociologists. This was the so-called Bielefeld school located with Bielefeld University in Germany. In the Nazi era, between these two, there was actually relative parity between the two disciplines and very recursive, iterative, dialogic exchange between them in the universities of Leipzig and Königsberg. But the problem was they were both self-de-autonomizing, as it were. They were both trying to work to benefit the Nazi party in ways that weren't even being required by the Nazi regime, but amazingly enough, they were self-heteronomizing or self-de-autonomizing. So I'm getting now into my fourth and my last set of reasons for studying the social sciences. The social sciences shape other political and social and economic events and processes that we might be interested in. There are really two distinct lines of inquiry here. First, we can analyze the intentional production and deployment of science to guide government policy. Or second, we can examine policies and practices that are influenced by social science unintentionally. There's some obvious examples of the first case, the intentional production of social science. And in fact, this is probably the most direct ancestor of social science being produced for the prince, for the king, for in cameralistics, which was the form of knowledge used in Central Europe. There are numerous examples in the modern period. Counterinsurgency research is one of those. These are photographs from the French counterinsurgency campaigns that were implemented during the Algerian Civil War in the 1950s and 60s. In this case, social scientists were asked to help design and run resettlement camps that were set up to undercut the uprising. Many of these social scientists were trained by the colonial officer and Durkheimian sociologist Robert Montaigne, shown here. Montaigne ran an outfit in Paris called the Center for Advanced Study for the Administration of Muslims. And he's shown here with his students on the left, training them. All of them had to have been active in the military or civil service. All of his students had at least 4 years of overseas colonial service, and they were all trained in Durkheimian sociology and other fields. And they were sent back to help run this. In Morocco, the colonial state had an entire branch of sociology that was dedicated to Durkheimian studies of the Moroccan people. That was actually where Montaigne got his start. So French Morocco and French Algeria were two hotbeds for this. But as we know, the US Defense Department also has funded social science projects on counterinsurgency since the 1950s. The most recent examples are the Human Terrain System, which ran from 2007 to 2014. It primarily used anthropologists, but the current Minerva Research Initiative involves social scientists from all disciplines. Another example of a social scientific framework that was used to inform policy is modernization theory. This emerged in response to Harry Truman's 1949 program for the improvement of underdeveloped areas. This was also linked to counterinsurgency. You see here an example of this. Walt Whitman Rostow, shown on the right, was one of the major modernization theorists, and he worked with the CIA and advised President Johnson during the Vietnam War. Here he's showing consulting with Johnson on the creation of strategic hamlets during a famous battle in the Vietnam War. In other instances, social science shapes policies and practices unintentionally and indirectly. In my book, The Devil's Handwriting, which was mentioned, I analyzed the effects of pre-colonial amateur and professional ethnography on government policies after the Germans conquered these places and made them into German overseas colonies. That is, starting in the 1880s. This was a way of empirically assessing a hypothesis that had been put forth by the famous Middle East scholar Edward Said, who argued in his 1979 Orientalism that, quote, "from travelers' tales, colonies were born." I tried to find out exactly how travelers' tales, which is his kind of word for travelers' tales and ethnographies, actually influence policy. In most cases, I found racial and cultural representations that informed colonial policy were not the product of any officially commissioned government research. Most of the images of the colonized on which policy was premised were, however, derived from travelers' tales or amateur ethnographies. The most dramatic case involving the German genocide of the Namibian Herero people in 1904, I argued, can only be explained by taking into account these pre-colonial ethnographic representations, particularly by the Lutheran missionaries in Namibia, which set the limits of possible policy, and in their very poverty and their very denigration of the people, in their very simplicity, weakened the hand of German colonial officials, even those who were trying to prevent the genocide. Tracing the connections between social science and policy requires then at least two kinds of specialized knowledge. And this is, I suppose, I am trying to legitimate what we're doing here this year. I'm saying that one of these kinds of legitimate social science research involves social science itself, the history thereof. And then we need to find out how that influences something else that we're really interested in. Okay, turning to part 3, how do we write the history of the social sciences? And I'll be much briefer on this. The methods. Here I can't really speak again for our whole seminar, but can sketch only my own approach, which tries to combine historical, sociological, and psychoanalytic methods. My research involves reconstructing personal and collective biographies of social scientific groups, the published and unpublished archives of their writing and correspondence, the fields and institutions in which they were trained and worked, and the wider array of institutions and processes shaping their work. I think, though, that combination of different factors is characteristic of most of the great work that we've been reading in our seminar this year. People no longer find that it's adequate only to focus on institutions or only to focus on texts, but want to bring both of those together. In fact, the importance of relying on unpublished as well as published sources has been revealed in a number of the things we've read this semester. One example from my own work that I wanted to present is from the papers of the German sociologist Richard Torvald, who was a pioneer of economic anthropology. He had a spotless reputation before 1936 and after 1945. He's cited by Marcel Mauss, by Michael Polanyi, by others. He's seen as a founder of the research on gift exchange because of his work in New Guinea before 1918. And he lived through 5 different regimes, which is an amazing thing too. He was from Austria, lived in pre-1918 Wilhelmine Germany, lived in the Weimar Republic, lived in Nazi Germany, lived at Yale University for a few years in the 30s, went back to Nazi Germany, went to East Germany and was at the Humboldt University, and then finally helped found the Free University of Berlin. So he's a kind of an amazing figure in that respect. But what's really unknown in the biographical work, which I discovered in the Humboldt University archives, is that Torvald was conscripted or agreed, it seems fairly voluntary, in this correspondence to participate in studies of forced labor for the Ministry of Armaments and Munition in 1942. And he was considered to be perfectly qualified for this because of his studies of forced labor in the German Melanesian colonies before 1918. He actually wrote extensively about forced colonial labor, so he was a specialist in that. The second methodological issue concerns paying attention to texts versus contexts. The latter, contexts, includes everything from scientific institutions to social factors. An illustration of the need to take into account the recursive relations between the social sciences and extra scientific contexts. Oh, I wanted to show you, for those of you who are sitting in the back, he even signs Torvald his letter, Heil Hitler. That's the letter that I found in the archives. An illustration of these relations between social sciences and extra scientific contexts is given by these photos, which show French psychologists carrying out psychological tests on Algerian subjects in the 1950s. The photo on the left reveals that the tests were carried out under the aegis of the colonial military. You see that there's not just a scientist, as in the middle, that's one of the psychologists, but a colonial military wearing a colonial military outfit. But what you also see in this photograph is that the testing is taking place under the watchful surveillance of the Qaid, the autonomous man on horseback, who's in the background there. And I have a close-up of him. He's the semi-autonomous headman of the Mek-Hadma tribe, keeping an eye on the scientists as they work. So it's a very complex situation. And in the literature, in the written literature, again, you don't find any mention of the fact that the tribal headsman was overseeing these tests. So here you had to go to the photographic archive to find this. A second example of the need to combine both is suggested by the work of the Hamburg-based sociologist Wolfgang Knöbel, who visited our seminar last week, and spoke about Max Weber and modernization theory. This is an interesting story he tells about modernization theory, and it could be a fairly straightforwardly contextual one, talking about Harry Truman and the things that I mentioned. But what Knöbel also shows is that this theory was combined with a particular reading of the German sociologist Max Weber, which saw him as a theorist of vast universal social processes, similar to what at that time in the US in 1950 they were calling modernization. In fact, as Knöbel pointed out, Weber was committed philosophically to the idea that there are no historical laws. There are no great processes like modernization. The modernization theorist's ability to misread Weber in this way was predicated upon Weber's own late introduction of a few terms like this, Knöbel pointed out. But this tendentious reading was also based on, Knöbel argues, the parochialism of American sociology between the war and the lack of macro-sociological theorizing. Let me conclude by saying a few words about another core term that I like to use and others in our seminar use, which is the concept of scientific field. This sounds a little bit technical, but please bear with me just for a moment. Like many of my colleagues, I draw here again on the work of Pierre Bourdieu. A field for Bourdieu is a semi-autonomous domain of a particular type of activity. And by analyzing this semi-autonomous domain in terms of the kinds of capital, symbolic capital he calls it, that are being competed for in that field, and the stakes that people are competing for, and by analyzing it in terms of positions and position takings, and in terms of its relative autonomy from the rest of the world, we can often make sense of moves within the scientific field that we couldn't understand otherwise. The important point is that a relatively autonomous field is one in which changes are driven primarily by internal struggles and dynamics, but internal struggles and dynamics derive from the kinds of resources that people bring from outside of the field into the field. Each field has its own rhythm, its own pace of development, but it's not entirely unconnected or disconnected from the outside world. It gives you a kind of a sophisticated way for thinking about what I've called text and context. I've tried to develop this theory in various ways, which I don't think I have time to go into, but let me end with a couple of diagrams that illustrate some of the interesting ways that people can try to make the field theory more spatially attentive, because his field theory has been accused of being a little bit too agnostic about space and about the ways in which actors move through space. So this is a life trajectory. I've already mentioned Torvald, who moved through all these historical periods. This is a sociologist called David Bettison, who recently died in New Zealand. But his life trajectory really took him all over the British Empire and the British post the Commonwealth. And that's not unusual for British and French, especially British social scientists and anthropologists and sociologists during this period. Another example is the literary field in Nazi Germany. and the trajectories of exiles who were forced out of Germany. And here you see the major German writers, from Theodor Adorno down to Arnold Zweig, and the different directions in which all of them were forced to go. And I think there's a lot of other interesting techniques that can be used to spatialize field theory. Now, I've talked mainly about my own work, but in the conclusion, let me tell you about the topics that we've covered in our theme seminar. In the first seminar, we talked about social science positivism and its critics. The second theme seminar talked about the relations between work by intellectual historians and sociologists working on intellectuals. So we compared two different disciplines attacking the same topic, intellectuals. In session 3, we looked at the problem of colonialism in the social sciences, asking whether these social sciences need to be decolonized. In other words, whether there are colonial assumptions that still are present. Another session looked at social science in socialist and post-socialist countries. A recent session was organized on funding in the social sciences. Now funding affects the production of social science. And last week, as I mentioned, we had the session with Knubel about modernization theory. Next week, we'll have a visit from David Kettler of Bard College, who's the leading world expert on Karl Mannheim, the person I mentioned at the very beginning. And then we'll have sessions on economics and philosophy. And then finally, in our marathon session, we'll present drafts of chapters that all of us are writing for a collective volume that we're putting together. In sum, to use the words of Thomas Kuhn, we seem to be moving toward a revolutionary phase of our social science history. Thank you.